So last week we started looking at Midrash, and we kind of did Midrash as in the fastest format possible, which is a kind of, oh, hey, look, here's all of the stuff about Midrash. We're going to go really fast because the idea was just a basic, okay, what is that? And it was, fast moving. I've largely kept the same texts. And I think that if we move slowly to get to kind of something more like a fuller understanding, I've actually expanded explanations in the PowerPoint and things like that. I think if we move a little slower, things will make more sense. And some of the texts that I had in there that we didn't actually get to are more complicated and require a little more unspooling. So we still kind of have the same goals, right? Understanding what Midrash is, knowing where Midrash can be found, understanding the basic process, understanding what it's for, and what makes it different from other kinds of biblical interpretation. And again, I worked off of translations found at Sepharia, though in many cases I actually just retranslated stuff today because Sepharia has specific translations of things that are from published works. And I don't necessarily agree with the way the published works translate everything. So in a couple of cases, I just went back and retranslated it. But having the English there is helpful. And just as a review for what is Midrash, it's a longish review, there's the process of Midrash, which is looking at the words of a biblical text, behind the text, beyond the text, into the text, and doing what we recognize as hanging sometimes pretty wild interpretations onto text, with the belief that many Midrashic interpreters have that what they're doing is finding meaning in the text and pulling it out. And that it's also, Midrash is also the end result of that process at an individual unit, and the texts themselves, the accumulated Midrashic texts. And we'll deal with all three so that Midrash is process and product. And we talked about the difference between Midrash Halakhah and Midrash Agadah, that Midrash Halakhah is the process of working out or working through how biblical texts can be used to support the rabbi's legal decisions. And Midrash Agadah is kind of broadly everything else, but is how the rabbis do theology. It's how the rabbis work through contradictions in the text for storytelling purposes, lots of other things like that. And just remembering that the rabbis don't think of themselves as making Midrash, they think of themselves as pulling Midrash out. And so we're always kind of on the lookout for what are the rules, what are the goals, what are people concerned about when they're reading these texts? Because Midrashic interpretations are attached very often to things that we would look at as problems with the text. The rabbis don't think it's a problem. The rabbis think it's pointing to the interpretations they're pulling out. And they recognize that there may be multiple interpretations that hang on one little particular quirk in the text, in a way that, as modern Western readers, we tend not to look at things quite that way sometimes. So I called Midrash Halakhah last week, understanding the rules without understanding the rules, that we were going to look at some legal texts without going through these 13 rules, 13 purported rules for determining what the halakha is when you look at a biblical text. Those 13 rules aren't the only set of rules, which is part of why I think maybe talking about the rules isn't all that important. I feel like I should kind of say that there's a set of 7 rules attributed to Rabbi Hillel. There's these 13 attributed to Rabbi Ishmael, and there's actually overlap, but not total overlap. That there's something in Hillel's list that isn't in Rabbi Ishmael's list, and Rabbi Ishmael has something else. So we're not going to make ourselves crazy from the rules. We're going to actually look at the texts, and sometimes the rules will matter and sometimes they won't. And when the rules matter, I'll let you know. So we want to remember that when you interpret a Midrashic text, when you're looking at it, you're trying to, with Midrash Halakhah, figure out the rule they have that they're trying to then hang on to the text. We want to sometimes keep in mind that when they say a particular verse, they're not actually talking about the part of the verse that we're looking at, that they may be talking about the other half of the verse, or they may be talking about a set of 2 verses and they're only mentioning a few words and you're supposed to know the rest. For modern people working with Midrash, what that really means is you have to open up the Tanakh and read the context to kind of figure out what they're talking about. And it becomes harder if you don't have access to the Hebrew. You kind of need expansion and interpretation to make that work. And then you want to figure out what's bothering them that they're attaching their interpretation to the verse or verses that they're looking at. Is there something redundant that we would call redundant? Is there something inconsistent? Do the words change in some important way that we don't necessarily latch onto right away? Is the terminology too narrow or too broad or something like that? So we saw a little bit of that, and we'll see more. And even the things that we already looked at last week, we'll look at in a little more detail, which will help make a little more sense out of it in theory. So we actually talked about this text last week. I've pulled it back up front because it was one of these examples of Midrash Halakhah can be from anywhere in the Tanakh. It doesn't just have to be from where there's an obvious law. So this is the second sheet of paper of the Talmud. So it's really the 3rd page, sort of. The Talmud is, every sheet of paper is called the daf, which is really a page. And then on either side is an amud. So this is the 3rd amud, the 2nd sheet, the 3rd. If you were numbering pages in an English book, it would be page 3, right? So this is them still discussing the Shema and saying, okay, well, you have until the end of the first watch to recite the Shema. That's one interpretation. And they're trying to figure out how many watches there are because it matters, right? If you divide the night into 3 watches or 6 watches or 12, it tells you how long you have to actually get this task done. And they agree that there's 3. And this is them telling us how they know there are 3 watches. Keeping in mind, there is absolutely nothing in the Torah or really anywhere in the Tanakh that comes right out and says, you have to recite the Shema. The Shema is exactly these texts. Here's when your start time is, right? They're figuring all of this stuff out based on biblical texts and attaching it. So this was them looking at a verse from Jeremiah and saying, oh, there are these 3 times where the same Hebrew word is used. And those 3 Hebrew words clue us into the idea that there's 3 watches in the night. So how do we know there's 3 watches? As it is taught in a Baraita, Rabbi Eliezer says the night has 3 watches, and over each and every watch, the Holy One, blessed be he, sits and roars like a lion. As it is said, Yahweh roars from on high, and from the abode of his holiness he sends forth his voice. He roars mightily over his dwelling place. And it's the reoccurrence of the Hebrew root shin aleph gimel once, twice, 3 times that gives them their hook. And I mentioned last week that this is sort of willful misreading of the biblical text because they understand the Hebrew grammar going on, and they understand there's no redundancy, that this is a normal grammatical construct in biblical Hebrew. It's not so normal after in Hebrew that comes from after the Bible, but it's totally normal in biblical Hebrew. And they know that, but they need a place to hang this 3 watches thing, and this works for them. And so this is what they do. And so we know the rule that they're trying to kind of hang on the biblical text is, okay, the night's divided into thirds, and how do we know? There's actually nothing necessarily bothering them with the biblical text. So the what's bothering them question that we have here and that I've talked about is not necessarily to be thought of as they're looking at the text and they think there's a problem, so much as they're looking at the text and they think there's an opportunity. They don't recognize doing this in the way that I've said it, right? This is us looking at them and saying, come on, the text doesn't really say that. They're looking at the text and thinking they really are finding this rule in this verse from Jeremiah. Jeremiah does not have very much in the way of Jewish law in it, so this is kind of a weird place to even be looking. But this is where they've pinned it down. So it's not necessarily them looking at the text and going, oh, there's something wrong there, so much as, oh, look at that repetition 3. Oh, that may be where. And they kind of try out the interpretation. Again, this is not how we read stuff. Not typically. So I know that we talked about that last time, but are there questions about it? Other than the obvious, are you kidding me? They really did that. Because that's a totally legitimate question, and the answer is yes.
Well, I have a question. Maybe you said this, but what is the word in Hebrew that is using for watch? What are the watches?
So the watch, there's absolutely no connection between the word watch and anything here. The word for watch in Hebrew is ashmurah. So Aleph, Shin, Mem, Vav, Resh, He. So the Mishnah talks about watches. Jeremiah is not talking about watches. There's no tie at all between these things. There are other biblical texts that do tie in, but not for this. There's just not a tie. So this is going to be a much more complex discussion, but I think it might be more interesting. So Martin Luther King Jr. said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And we know that the rabbis understand that you don't take people's eyes out when they hurt each other, right? We don't chop off a finger anymore. It's not clear how they got to that interpretation, but they have it. And what we watch happen in the Talmud and a couple of other places is them figuring out how to avoid the biblical text that very clearly says, if you put someone's eye out, you have to have your eye put out in return. So this is, if you've never heard this Latin phrase before, the phrase is lex talionis. I'm going to type it in the chat box because I realize not everybody is going to be up on their law Latin. And lex talionis just literally means the law of retaliation. That's what talionis means in Latin, is retaliation. So lex talionis has a history in Roman law. So it's not just the biblical text that thinks, oh yeah, well, you know, if somebody cuts off your hand, you cut their hand off in return. But this is the section of the Talmud where they're worried about what we would call criminal law and civil law and property law and all of these other things. Um, and so the name of the tractate is Bava Kama. There are 3 Bavas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, and they are the first, middle, and last gate. Why gate? Because courts in the ancient Near East sat at the gate of the city. So the idea is we're making rules for how courts work and substantive law, and this is where we're doing it. Because we know our courts are going to sit at the gate of the town. And the question is, okay, how did we get to the idea that you have to pay money? And there are a lot of midrashic approaches to it. None are really authoritative on their own. And I say the Talmud here rejects every offered explanation that comes up. It does eventually pick one. It is a very weird midrash that does it. And there has been a lot of scholarly research that actually says the rabbis know that they are actually interpreting the Bible backwards. So they have actually worked really hard to turn the rules upside down so that they are not, so that they're not having to follow what the text of the Torah says, which is really a large chunk of what Midrash does, is to make the Torah say something the Torah doesn't say. It's not all of it, it's not even the majority, but some important parts do, and this is a really important part. And it's also one of those things that people say, oh, you know, Jewish tradition legally is very vengeful, eye for an eye, and the rabbis ran from that as fast as they could. So the problem is, how do the rabbis know? They're trying to figure it out. They obviously want to prove this from the biblical text, even though the biblical text says the exact opposite of what they're trying to prove. So we have this guy, Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda, who says in a Baraita, so this is something, this is outside the Mishnah, but older than the Talmud. That's a Baraita. So Rabbi Dostai says, eye for an eye in Leviticus means money. The Talmud's phrasing is really, really awkward everywhere. The Talmud is mostly written in Hebrew. You hear this like, oh, the Talmud's in Aramaic. The technical argumentation is in Aramaic. And the technical argumentation in Aramaic is actually in almost like shorthand. So it's not particularly easy to penetrate. So the Aramaic actually just says, you say. What they mean to say is, if you were to say, are you sure that it's money? Maybe you really are supposed to take someone's eye out. This is the Talmud questioning Rabbi Dostai. And then you say, look, it happened. This one's eye is bigger than the other one. How can I literally do eye for an eye? This is very difficult to penetrate language. This is actually a really, really old Midrash. It's written in the style of Midrash that comes from before the Mishnah. Its language is typical for that, but it's not typical for the storytelling Midrash that people like to read. So what he's pointing out is, what happens if someone's eye is bigger than the other person's eye? So person A puts out person B's eye. Person A's eye is smaller than person B's, physically smaller. How can I say it's eye for an eye? The punishment is supposed to be the same for everybody. So he's saying, look, there's this biblical verse down here, Leviticus 24:22. There shall be one judgment for you. If person A's eye is smaller than person B's, and we take out person A's eye for harming person B, and his eye is smaller, is the punishment equal? Rabbi Dostai's answer is no. So we have a problem. And the way you fix the problem is you charge money. So when I have myself pinned so that I'm the only person recording, I can't see your faces. So I don't know how incredulous your facial appearances are at this point. It's very justified for you to have a very incredulous looking face that says, wait, are you kidding me? This is the argument that's happening here. He's saying, oh, legally this can't work because people's eyes are different sizes. Because maybe people's eyes are different colors, right? This is kind of a ridiculous explanation. This makes more sense than the last example. I feel like I have to point out that this makes more sense because it's more straightforward law. It's not totally out of the blue. It's going to make less sense. I can always say that about Midrash. I can always make it make less sense. But this is his rationale. The eyes might be different sizes, so how's that equal? So what's the rule? Somebody is injured, we need to do one-for-one punishment, but if we can't, we have to order the payment of money. Rabbi Dostai says, look, it doesn't work. All eyes are not alike, so we can't literally apply eye for an eye. But this is a basic assumption in all Midrash. The Torah is not wrong. If you're getting the wrong answer, it's your interpretation of it that's wrong, not the Torah. So we have to figure out how to show that it's right. The rabbis don't think of themselves as doing this, right? They think that they're finding the interpretation in the Torah, not looking at the Torah and saying, and they're not, the rabbis don't think of themselves as curing their cognitive dissonance. This is very much how we think of the rabbis dealing with the biblical text. This is how many modern scholars think of it too. So this is not me coming and saying, this is all their cognitive dissonance. This is all their cognitive dissonance about a text that's supposed to be perfect. So we know money's the right answer, and what the Talmud is trying to do is cycle through explanations to get to the right answer. And it has to hang it on the biblical text because that's where all of this stuff comes from. If you're going to completely reread the Torah, you have to hang it on the Torah itself. So this is Rabbi Dostai's explanation. Eyes are not the same. The Talmud says, well, you're wrong. The Talmud spends a lot of time telling people they're wrong, so that's not remarkable. But here's the Talmud's explanation. So the rabbis look at this and say, well, what's the problem here? If somebody puts somebody else's eye out and it causes the person to be blind, doesn't that mean we should take his sight? Person A blinds person B, so what we really ought to be doing is taking somebody's sight. And if that's the case, you don't care about the size of the eyes, you care about their function. And then they say also, if you care about size, if a small person kills a larger one or a large person kills a smaller one, how do you exact capital punishment on the murderer? Because if a small person killed a larger one, does the small person die and then there's something else that has to be given? If a large person killed a smaller one, do you not have to kill the large person? So they're looking at the size argument and saying, if we apply this across the board, this is a problem. And they say the very same verse that Rabbi Dostai cares about, there shall be one judgment for you, is the very verse that undoes Rabbi Dostai's interpretation. You can't have equal judgment that way because we can't apply that in the case of murder. And we can't apply that in the case of even putting somebody else's eye out because aren't eyes important not for their size, but for what they do? So this is sort of their, no, you're wrong. If you took his life, scripture says we should take life. So here, if he took his sight, scripture says we take his sight. This is literally how they frame it. Sometimes people kind of go, okay, wait a second. well, can't you just say money for everything? So they go, well, if somebody commits a murder and the sizes are different, can't you just like have somebody pay money for committing murder? The rabbis have already rejected that earlier on in the page, and what they've done is basically looked at murder and looked at injuries and said murder and injuries aren't the same. So we don't really make the same rules in the same ways. You are also right if you notice that they started making rules for injuries based on rules for murder. This is exactly what they did. Oh, we can't apply that in the murder case. But this is their critique of the, well, eyes are different sizes. How do we actually figure it out? The Talmud eventually gets there, and it says, oh, Rav Ashi said, we derive monetary damages from another verse, Deuteronomy 22:29, for how he has afflicted, defiled her. So what verse he's talking about is, it's really two verses. And the first verse says, if a man comes across a maiden in the field and forcibly lies with her, he has to marry her. And the he has to marry her is he has to take her for a wife for how he has afflicted, defiled her. The verb used is afflicted. Some translations say afflict, some say defile. But that's their basic principle is, okay, so look, we have this, and they're looking at, okay, that's an injury to a person. We have an injury to a person with eye for an eye. And what we're saying here is, in this other case, we didn't say, well, you have to exact exactly the same punishment from the man. Because what is that? To begin with, the man's no longer a virgin. The Torah doesn't so much care about virginity in men to begin with. That's not a category it really works with all that much. And there's no comparable punishment to incur in their mind. We can think of things, we'll put that to the side. They just don't see it. So they have to come up with an explanation. The Torah has to have an alternative, and so the alternative for the Torah is he has to marry her. And the rabbis say, see, the preposition for here in Deuteronomy is the same one as the for in Leviticus. So the Hebrew preposition is tachat. Tachat can mean under, tachat can mean for, tachat can mean because of, tachat can mean in substitution for, tachat can mean below, B-E-L-O-W. So they say, look, Deuteronomy 22:29, ignore the zero, Deuteronomy 22:29 says for tachat, instead of how he defiled her, on account of how he defiled her. And it says eye for an eye tachat eye instead of an eye. And they say, ta-da, same prepositions, we've solved the problem. It takes them 2 pages of Talmud to get to that answer. So never let it be said that they are unwilling to make ridiculous arguments. They go through all of these arguments to then arrive at the conclusion, oh, the preposition's the same, it's fine. Okay, so questions about that?
So I'm jumping right in here in the middle, but this is an emperor's new clothes situation. Why didn't somebody in all the centuries say this is ridiculous?
Because it's the Torah, so you can't say it's ridiculous from their perspective.
It's not the Torah, it's the Talmud. The rabbis are being ridiculous.
Well, the rabbis are being ridiculous from our perspective. But remember, they think that they are engaged in the holy work of pulling the meaning out of the Torah. So from a traditional Jewish perspective, this isn't ridiculous. There will eventually be a realization that some of what the Talmud does is maybe a little over the top. And as soon as people have that realization, they then also start interpreting over the top as well. So there is a problem within the broader framework of Rabbinic Judaism of the study of Talmud that makes things become obscure because we're smart and watch us do obscure things. There are entire movements of Jewish thought that are intended to fix the problems that come with people being too smart for their own good.
Can I just say here that I had heard that the original eye for an eye was actually an improvement on the previous moral code, which was, you know, if somebody takes your eye out, you can like kill their brother. Like people would do worse things in retaliation. Is that right? That was actually attempting to fix an earlier problem?
I don't know if we would say that it was trying to fix something necessarily. There are lots of sample legal codes hanging around from the ancient Near East in cuneiform on little clay tablets or whatever. And some of them do provide punishments that are disproportional to the harm done, but not all of them do.
But the eye for an eye is not an invention of the Torah. It came over within Hammurabi.
Can't hear you, Ami.
We can't hear you, Ami.
So Ami said that the eye for an eye thing comes out of the Code of Hammurabi, which is depending on how old you think Leviticus is, the Code of Hammurabi may be 1,500 years older, depending on how you time it. So it's probably very fair to say that they knew about the Code of Hammurabi. And the Code of Hammurabi does have some punishments that would seem disproportionate compared to the Torah, but not all of them are. So Jack, you have a virtual hand up?
I do. So what is there like a natural stopping point for this midrashic email exchange? That is to say, so there's the proposition that the sizes of the eyes are different, and so that's how we get to money damages. Yeah, so there's a clear goal, there's an outcome that they want, and interpretations that they need to find to get there. And so rabbis don't like that, criticize that, come up with this. Why does it stop here? Is there a sort of general consensus that, this is the best we can do in order to achieve the outcome that we want? Why wasn't there more? And you get my question about stopping point.
Yeah.
The scheme. Yeah,
so this is actually a page and a half, 2 pages in. I think it's important. So I say page and I make it seem like, oh, right, a page. Here's a vacuum cleaner manual. This is actually our vacuum cleaner manual. Oh, sorry, our carpet cleaner manual. And so I make it sound like a page is, a page. A page of Talmud is not a page. A page of Talmud turns into 10 pages in translation. So think of them as spending 20 pages on this. And 20 pages of small type, and there's commentary all around the sides. So they spend 20 pages on this, our equivalent of 20 pages. And they land here. It's not clear from the way they land here that they think that this is actually the right interpretation. What happens is they cycle through a bunch of interpretations. This is the last one, and they move on to a different topic. That is a very Talmud thing to do. Very few full-length discussions in the Talmud actually end with a conclusion. Some do, many don't. This is one that doesn't. this is the only interpretation that they don't attack. And so we're left to maybe conclude that this is the one that they got to. And moving forward in time, when it does get discussed, it seems as though this is the one that the tradition, looking at these pages of Talmud, finally says, yeah, that's the right one. Because what happens is they cycle through various ways of reading eye for an eye. Size, function, level of pain. So they actually hypothesize that maybe what you're supposed to do is match the pain that was endured by the victim. So how do you do that? And then they realize, oh, but people have different sensitivities to pain, so we can't do that. They just keep going and keep going and keep going and rejecting them until they get to this. And then once they get to this, they almost reconsider and start to think, oh, maybe it really is about physical damage that you should do to somebody. And then they start to attack the people who say, oh, it has to be physical damage. And Nadine says if they don't decide, they can talk about it again tomorrow. Yes. It's useful, I think, to know that what's happening in the Talmud and what's happening in Midrash is not really about splitting hairs for the sake of splitting hairs. And it's also not really about reaching a functional rule. These are texts that teach thinking. So the Talmud is not a reference book. The Midrash is not a reference book. They are books that are there to spool out arguments so that student rabbis can see how you reach decisions. How detailed do you have to be? What kinds of arguments do you have to anticipate? So it is sort of like going to graduate school for Jewish law, that they're teaching the interpretive methods. It's like taking a logic class in college where you study absurd arguments because it's teaching you the rules of logic, not because the arguments are necessarily true. That's a large part of what's happening in the Talmud, is it's about teaching, not about the answer at the end of that discussion, because most discussions don't end with an answer. And there's actually a Aramaic word that they sometimes end the discussions with. The Aramaic word is kashya, which means it's hard. We don't know. Moving on. And so they'll just, we can't say kashya. Let's keep going, because it's not about the answer. And it's not about just digging in. There is this sense that a lot of modern scholars have developed that this is about teaching thought, teaching a particular way of thinking. So Joyce, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just to very quickly make sure I understand this. So they're saying tachat means instead of, and so that's how they can get to money instead of this? Is that what are the...
So tachat means instead of, and it's used in both places, right? So there are other prepositions that also mean for, F-O-R. And if they used one of those other ones, they wouldn't be able to make this tie. And it's useful to know that they're actually following the rules of Midrash when they do this. So Michael, you have your hand up, and then we'll look at this slide.
Can't hear you.
Oh, muted.
How do we tell him that he can't hear
Oh.
us?
Michael, I think you're muted.
I gave a whole long speech.
Didn't hear any of it.
On the issue of the motivation, I always thought that the reason they were trying to move from the law of retaliation to monetary damages is that they had moved from being an agricultural people to an urban people. They've now lived for a long time in the Greek world and the Roman world, and I always assumed that they were kind of seeing civilized people don't legally put people's eyes out and chop their arms off. They use monetary damages, and they were mimicking what they saw around them as what civilized people do. But you mentioned that the Romans actually had a law of retaliation, which a little bit surprises me. So anyway, I'm just saying that's what I always thought, that they were simply kind of moving with the times in this kind of a transition.
The trouble with that, there are a couple of troubles. One of them is there are an awful lot of rabbis that are in the Talmud who are farmers. So agriculture is still clearly a part of what they do. And they're concerned about not mixing species of animals and not mixing species of plants. So they have that concern. The other part of it is there's nothing in the Talmud that suggests that they were looking at anybody else's rules when they made this shift. So sometimes they'll kind of let on that there's some other concept they're looking at. And there's none of that here. And then, so some of them live in Rome and some of them live in Persia. And from the perspective of the ones living near Rome or living in Roman Palestine, I mean, the Romans are crucifying people for not killing people, right? So Roman punishments are disproportionate too. So it doesn't seem to be oh, look, more civilized people do this. There may be an unacknowledged response to the fact that they are not free to impose their own punishments anymore. Because if you're a dominated society, you're dominated by an imperial culture with a civil government, they're not going to just let you kill people. And they're not going to let you just chop people's hands off. So there may be some level of necessity here that then drives them to find other explanations. But this would have happened pretty early. So even in the Babylonian exile, so we're talking now 800 years before the Mishnah, Jews can't follow the rules that they have anymore. So it may have been really early that they started preserving these texts and then saying, oh, but that's not the rule. We don't really know because they wrote the old rule without any interpretive material packaged along with it. So this, okay, I'm gonna have to go forward to go back. So we looked at this word tachat instead of, or however you want to put it. And I said this follows a rule, actually. So there are rules of Midrash. And we talked about the 13 rules of deriving Halakhah from the Torah. And this, we're going to do tachat in two places and say it works, is actually following one of their rules. It's actually rule number 2 in Rabbi Ishmael's list, if you wanted to punish yourself and find the list again. It seems out of the blue to us, but they're using one of his rules. And one of his rules is Gezerah Shava, which means nothing unless you know Hebrew. Gezerah Shava means equal decree. So the idea that words, the same word in multiple places in the same kind of subject area means the same thing. So in this case, they're looking at this thing with a rape, and they're looking at this thing with a physical injury, and they're saying, tachat here, they're both personal injuries. They need to have the same kind of penalty, and we know that from tachat. Or at least we know you can't impose exactly the identical harm. That's not how it works. Tachat is our clue. It means the same thing in both places. So that's half of it. And the other half of it is they then end with something where they go, also, I don't know if I preserved that. I did. So this is the entire text that ends this conversation. Rather, Rav Ashi said we derive monetary damages for how he has defiled her, right, this tachat. A rule concerning people is derived from one concerning people, and concerning damages from damages. So tachat and tachat are the same subject area, and then they say, you figure out whether people are harmed, that's one classification of rules, and then how you punish them is another classification of rules. And we don't treat them as the same. And this seems like it might be a little confusing. And what they're actually saying here is, we had to make the rule this way because we couldn't find any other way of getting out of the cyclical problem that we had of somebody comes up with some explanation for why you don't take an eye out because eyes are different sizes, or somebody's blind and somebody's not. And they're kind of admitting every time we did that, every time somebody said, oh, well, you can't take an eye out every time because people's eyes are different sizes. Every time we did that, we ran up against this verse that said, nope, has to be the same rule. Nope, has to be the same rule. Nope, has to be the same rule. And they said, instead, it's got to be the same rule for figuring out what is a harm against a person. And there has to be a set of rules that are the same for how you figure out how to punish people. And they're not the same sets of considerations. Because otherwise you get stuck in this loop of, oh, well, maybe it's because eyes are smaller. Well, no, that can't be right, because then can you execute somebody if they're smaller than the person that they killed? Oh, maybe it's because somebody is blind. Well, okay, but what if the person who committed the crime is blind, right? They can go through all of these hypotheticals. They even reach a point where they say, well, maybe it means that somebody's just exempt from punishment. And then they go, well, that can't be right. The Torah doesn't say anything about that. So this Gezerah Shava thing applies not just to the preposition, but to the whole categories. And so they're saying there's two things here. One is prepositions, but also we're talking about damages now. And that's its own set of laws. And we don't have to continue to think about the person harmed compared to the person who did the harming. We just worry about the penalty. So, questions? I can't see you, so I can't tell if you're still awake.
We're awake.
Okay, I want to make sure, because I can't keep everybody else's face off the recording and see you, I think is how I want to put that. So Michael, is your hand up, or is it up from last time?
So this just makes it easier for them because now they have wider latitude of rules to think about.
Yeah, they have more flexibility in how they make the rules, because they don't have to put together identifying an injury with the punishment. Okay. Which then allows them to do things like say, oh, well, You're a farmer and you're a scribe. And so the compensation is going to be different because you use your body parts for different things and there's different value involved with that, which is very much like what modern legal approaches to damages are. You hire an economist and the economist comes in to give testimony and the economist says, well, you know, somebody who works in this job who loses a hand, this is what the hand is worth to them, right? There's all these tables and things that people use. This frees them up to do the same kind of thing. Maybe not with an economist, but it does free them up to do the same kind of calculation, to then say, we can measure damages separately and we don't have to get tied up with who the person is that did the hurting and who the person is that was harmed.
So the rules make sense. The rules make sense, but they're I think obviously what we're all struggling with is, you know, why did they feel like they had to tie it to the language? And that is because, you know, obviously the Torah is the law and they can't just say we're making up these rules, right?
Right. And that's exactly their problem. Is a lot of the times the rules make a lot of sense when you actually just look at what their rules are, but they have to tie it to this text, and this text can be impenetrable, and the text often says things they don't want it to say.
Right.
And so the project becomes showing how the text says the thing it doesn't say. Right. And this is an example of that. This isn't even the most complex example of it.
That would, like what Larry said earlier, you know, why didn't people say this is all hogwash? You know, I mean, it really, now we think of it as this is calling into question not only your rule, you know, not only the text, but certainly your rule. It doesn't, anyway, that's just my.
Yeah. So there will be kind of a back and forth over time on this. So Maimonides in the 12th century, early 13th century, writes a legal code called the Mishneh Torah. It's the only work, the only major work anyway, he wrote in Hebrew. So he intended it for the use of the whole world, the whole Jewish world. And his premise was, I'm going to give you all the rules, and then you don't have to study so much Talmud anymore. Because he recognized that there are problems with this. In fashion that the Jewish world works, somebody immediately wrote a commentary and pointed out all the times that Maimonides misread the Talmud. So Maimonides didn't get it right. That's a problem. But this will be a back and forth over time so that you will get entire movements of thought whose goal is to undo some of the bad thinking that comes into real life because people study this text. So there is an ethical movement called Musar. Musar comes from the yeshiva world of the late 1700s. And the point of Musar is there were yeshiva heads who were watching students learn Torah and be able to apply it and figure out the rules and do all of this interpretation, which is sometimes called pilpul. And so we have all these pilpulniks, these people who can do all of this interpretation and understand this very strange logic. And then they're terrible people. They're unlikable people, but they're following the Torah's rules. And these rabbis are watching this and saying, well, this is terrible, because actually this is contrary to what we want the Torah to do. We want the Torah to make people better. So clearly whatever we're doing is the wrong approach. We need to do this other thing. So they create, this is the start of the Musar movement. Musar literally means correction. So the idea is that half the day you study Musar, half the day you study Talmud, and your bad thinking in the real world is fixed a little bit by studying Musar. Which of course, a very predictable thing happens. People start doing the same thing to Musar. right? Because this mode of thinking, if this is what you spend all your time doing, this is how your brain starts to work. Just like people who work very heavily in certain industries start to see the whole world from that perspective, same thing happens here.
Well, that actually brings up another quick question, which is like, who is this that's doing, I mean, are these people like full-time studying this all day, or are these like farmers doing it on their day off?
So they are a combination of people. There are some who are farmers or leather tanners and are poor, and there are some who are very wealthy and can do this all day. It's a mix. And there are actually little stories in the Talmud of the rich ones sometimes not realizing how bad the state of the poor ones is. You know, one is a blacksmith, and a rich rabbi sees his home and, you know, finally has this realization, oh my gosh, the walls of this guy's home are black because he works all the time. So the Talmud even has these stories that kind of suggest that some of these people are a little bit lacking in empathy because of their social class or whatever the case may be. So there's an awareness, but it never really becomes the center.
Interesting.
But this lets you see, this whole process lets you see how you can take a biblical text and get it to mean the exact opposite of what it seems to mean on its face. And when you do that, that's very midrash and very not kind of plain text interpretation. The plain text interpretation is put that guy's eye out. What happens if you can't put that guy's eye out? I don't know. Right? That's where the plain text ends. And this is how they deal with these problems, is by saying, the text actually says something else. And then they work really hard to show you the something else. Whether you're convinced by it or not is a different story. A lot of this is not convincing to us, but it was convincing to them. Because they had these rules that said, when the two words are the same, okay, it works. We don't necessarily think of it that way. Because we would want to see, instead of ayin tachat ayin, an I in place of an I, we would want to see kesef tachat ayin, money instead of an I. Because that's what the plain sense of the text is for us. Of course you have to pay money. They think that too. They just have to get there a very circuitous way because the text can't be wrong. And we look at the Torah from a remove and say, it's a human text. Do something different. And their perspective is, we can't do something different unless it's in there. And this is how we find it in there, is we have all of these rules that when we follow the rules, if we do it right, we get the right answer out the back end. So I don't expect that it makes full sense. What I'm hoping is that you're starting to see what the issues are that they have to deal with and how that gets you very strange interpretations to us that are totally normal to them. Because bridging that gap is actually kind of necessary for then being able to read Midrash without going, this is crazy. It's a little less crazy here. It's very crazy in other places. Ami.
Yeah, I want to say that it actually, the way you explain it, it's not altogether doesn't make sense. These are people who are more reasonable than those who are the Torah, who are, agricultural tribes that made perfect sense for them to have an eye for an eye. And these are people at a later time that don't want to take eyes as the practice of the state, and so they because as you explain, they can't just negate what the Torah said, so they just turn what the Torah said upside down. It makes sense to me when you think about it.
I mean, we'd call it motivated reasoning today, right? Because that's what it is. It's motivated reasoning.
Do you think that they realized that they were actually bullshitting for good purpose, but they were bullshitting for good purpose? Do you think they realized that, or they rationalized that this is actually the way it had to be done?
I think they rationalized it. I think that's what the 13 rules are. Because the 13 rules, this Baraita of Rabbi Yishmael, which gives the 13 rules of interpretation, and this Gezerah Shava rule is number 2 on the list. Those rules are at the very beginning of one of the earliest collections of halachic midrash. So they're already kind of setting up, okay, we know things are really sometimes don't look like they match up to the plain text, but if you follow these rules, you'll see how everything works out. So did they make the rules knowing what their explanations were going to be? Or did they receive these rules and start to apply them? I don't know.
I believe that in a way, by doing so, they created a tradition of Jewish liberalism. People ask sometimes, how can Jews be liberal given what's written in the Old Testament? And that's the answer, that actually generations of students of yeshivas never learned the Jewish Bible. They learned Talmud. They learn everything from the Talmud. They learn already the interpretation of the Talmud.
Right. And what Ami is talking about is when you go to yeshiva, nobody studies the Tanakh directly. Or it's very rare. So what happens if you follow kind of a very traditional yeshiva-oriented educational practice, like what happens in Crown Heights or something like that in some of these communities, the elementary school ages, you learn Hebrew and you study the Torah, but you're studying the Torah with interpretations all around it. And then for a few years, you study the Mishnah, right? These just statements of rules, again, with interpretations around it. So you already know, as you're studying the Mishnah, you already know where the Talmud's interpretation is going to go, because the main commentary that in a traditional setting is used on the Mishnah summarizes what's in the Talmud. So that by the time you start studying Talmud, you already know what everything is going to say. And you're not studying the Torah very much anymore. You see the Torah during Torah reading, and you read it during Torah reading. And you may go look up a verse in order to understand something that you're seeing in the Talmud, but you never just read the Torah anymore. It's only after you get through the yeshiva process that you then sometimes come back to reading Torah. But even in that setting, a very Orthodox Jew never really reads the Torah by itself.
Why?
So this, because the sense is that you can't really take the Torah's text all by itself, because you get to very strange conclusions. Like, you can take somebody's eye out. They just don't want people getting to that answer. And so the saying is, twice in the Torah, once with Onkelos, once with Rashi. So you read whatever the verse is in the Torah twice in Hebrew, and then you read the Aramaic translation of it once. Sometimes it's a translation and sometimes it's a paraphrase. And then you read Rashi, because Rashi tells you the things in the verse that you should be concerned about. So that you're always reading the Torah through a filter.
So Reb Tevye was BSing when he says, like the good book says, because clearly he didn't actually read the good book.
So Tevye is always making it up. Because, so the point with Tevye is he's very uneducated and he actually doesn't know. So, you know, one of his, as the good book says, if a Jew eats a chicken, one of them is sick. Where's that? He doesn't know. He doesn't have any text for it. He's pretty unlettered, actually.
Right.
But he knows if you tie it to a text, you make it more authoritative. So even somebody who really doesn't study and really doesn't know understands that you tie to text. And that's how you make something real in this kind of textual culture.
Authoritative.
Right. And it's a textual culture that is doing this based on a text that it also thinks shouldn't be written. Because this is the oral Torah. It's only being written down as a concession because people forget. That's the myth, the story that they tell themselves about their origin is we only do this because we have to. Michael.
So about these rules, they must have known. I mean, these are, if nothing else, smart people, because, right? So they must have understood that they could apply these exact same rules and come up with virtually any answer, or certainly answers other than the answer they're coming up with. So it's not just they're saying that we're applying these rules to the Torah and necessarily coming up with this. They know that there's all these forks in the road, but they choose the forks that lead them to their knowledge that pre-existed of what, as you said, the oral Torah says, which is monetary damages for an eye.
Right, but that's not their self-image. So on the one hand, they know it. On the other hand, it's not how they view them. How they view what they're doing. Which actually is a lot how lawyers used to work.
Still work.
Well, still work, right? Right. So there's this big debate that you eventually learn about in law school where you have positivists who say, no, everything is made up. And then you have this sort of older approach or understanding of what judges do when they make law, which is that they're like finding the rules in the air and plucking them out like they were always there. And we didn't make the law, we found the law. This is how the rabbis think of themselves, like, oh, we found it. They understand the rules are maybe kind of guiding them, but they don't agree on what the rules are. Right? So Rabbi Hillel has 7 rules and Rabbi Ishmael has 13, and they're not identical sets of rules. So there's obviously something else going on. So Jack, you've got a hand up.
So despite the kind of gnarly methodology, it's kind of easy to understand what's going on with Midrash Halakhah, where you've got a set of social rules or practices, and you need to find a way of justifying them in terms of the perfect text. Could you say, unless you're otherwise planning to do it, could you say a word or 3 more about the other kind of midrash where you're not aiming for a text-based justification for otherwise established social practices, but you've got other goals in mind?
So I'll say a little bit, but that's actually a lot of next week.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. So all this other stuff, the Midrash Halakhah, which when you go and pull a volume of Midrash, if you went to a yeshiva library and you found a volume of Midrash, it's almost all Midrash Halakhah, because the stuff that matters, Midrash Halakhah, is already in the Talmud. The Midrash Halakhah is kind of all over the place. And they, again, say that they're finding interpretations in the Torah, deriving them from what's in the text. But a lot of times what you can actually see them doing, just like we can see them hanging rules wherever they can find a good spot, what you see them doing is finding something in the text and using it as a prompt to then say something else. Clarifying something about how the world works by talking about the creation of the world. Or they have a story to explain XYZ thing, and they find a biblical verse that they can hang the story on. Or they have some weird story that they think explains the meaning of what's already in the text, and so they expand on the meaning of the thing by telling the story. The Joseph story is a really great example of this. So the Joseph story, the biblical text for the Joseph story kind of explains that at the beginning that Joseph is a brat. Let's go with it. Joseph is a brat. There is a midrashic interpretation that looks at his behavior, looks at a specific term in it, and compares him to a bird, which seems not very sensical until you realize that what they're doing is they're comparing his behavior to somebody who is effeminate. Or in other words, from their perspective, Joseph is acting, quote unquote, gay. Because he's doing this thing, and this thing is something that women do. And why is Joseph doing this thing? And they compare him to a bird. Why is this important? What's the word for bird in Yiddish?
Fegele.
Right.
It means a gay man.
Right. So this midrash is explaining Joseph's behavior and also carries through into Yiddish. So when I kind of say midrash is important and it carries forward, this is an example that this is a meaning that carries forward over time.
Wow.
But we'll see lots and lots and lots of that stuff next week, because there's plenty of very weird stuff all over the place. And the thing that I guess is vaguely useful to know, they read every text this way. So the Talmud reads the Midrash, reads the Mishnah the way it reads the Torah. It follows very similar rules. And they even do the Gezerah Shava thing where they say tachat here and tachat there. They do that with Midrash Halakhah. The methods of reading aren't really that different. The latitude with which they play with the text is much greater in Midrash Halakhah, because in theory the stuff doesn't bind, but it's also an opportunity for all kinds of speculation that they don't do systematic philosophical speculation. They don't do systematic theology the way Christians will do it. This is how they work through those issues, is going line by line and tying pieces of scripture together to get to a conclusion. So I can't tell. So Michael and Ami, you have hands up, but I don't remember if they're hands up from before or later. But Nadine is unmuted, so I'm going to let Nadine go.
Okay, this is short, but it's a short question. I'm not sure you can answer that, or have time to answer this now. But how, or maybe you don't want to, but how did they actually decide what to write down? In other words, they spent hours and hours and hours and hours, days and days talking about this stuff, and then something got written down. How did they decide what we're seeing now?
It is not 100% clear. To some extent, these collections of texts, we get them with no context, right? So we're accustomed to books having introductions. Even Greco-Roman books in the ancient world came with introductions. There's no introduction to rabbinic texts. So we don't know what they were thinking. We don't even know when the books actually come from. Some of these things are guesses, where we have versions of Aramaic from all over the ancient Near East, and you kind of are looking at the Aramaic in a text and saying, oh, it looks like that one and not like that one, like that one, but not like that one. And you're guessing. So we don't always know. Some of it seems to be cultural. So there are more straight Midrashic collections that come out of the land of Israel than come out of the Babylonian Jewish community, which suggests that there's some kind of difference between how they view the rabbinic enterprise, because the Babylonian community goes all in on the Talmud in a way that the land of Israel Jewish community doesn't. There is a Talmud of the land of Israel, the Palestinian Talmud. It is not as well developed. It is not as sharp in its reasoning. It is not nearly as long. It is not as well preserved. But that same culture was generating Midrash, was generating Midrashic collections when the other one was not. But the one in Babylon is the authoritative Talmud. So there's cultural differences that explain the genre, but there's not a lot to tell us why those were preserved. Particularly because sometimes the same interpretation is preserved under two different names, and we don't really understand why that is. So, Ami, you have a hand up and you're unmuted.
No, that was the earlier one.
Oh, okay. So we are at 8:53, which isn't necessarily a natural cutoff point, but I don't want to keep anybody if they have things to do. It's also a fairly clean break for us to start looking at Midrash Agadah next week, which is both easier to wrap your hands around and in some ways harder to wrap your hands around. But it's certainly easier to read and understand what they're saying.
It's more fun too.
It is more fun. Yes, it is more fun. And I'll bring Sefer Agadah, which is a big collection of Midrash, so that you can see. You can just pick up a book that's got all of the stuff in it to look at. Okay, so if you have questions in the interim, please feel free to let me know. This video will be up probably in a day or two. And if you need the PowerPoint, let me know that too, and I can send that along.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. This is fascinating.
All right, thanks everyone. Good night.
Good night.